Hello, friends. It's great to be with you. I appreciate the ministry of FWCC, and I want to thank them for the opportunity to be with you, even if it just turns out to be virtual today. You would think that the practice of loving your neighbor would be simple, right? I mean, how hard can it be? I have great neighbors, kind, generous, caring people whom I have an affection and regard for almost all the time. But then I remember who their neighbor is and how he's not always very easy to get along with, let alone love. Maybe if I was my neighbor, I would recognize how hard it is, or it can be, to love your neighbor and why the Bible emphasizes this so much. I'm so glad that FWCC chose to highlight neighbor love as the theme for this gathering. I honestly can't think of anything more crucial or desperately needed right now. In a world that often feels like it's on fire and completely out of our control, here's something that is concrete and tangible we can do. And though it might not change the world for everyone, it may change it for someone if we love our neighbor. In the time that I have with you today, I'd like to consider the story of the Good Samaritan, but maybe from a bit different perspective than we normally read it. I imagine that most of us are familiar with the parable of Jesus that Jesus teaches in Luke chapter 10. Here's how it goes. A scholar of the law shows up to test Jesus on what qualifies a person for eternal life. But rather than answering his question, Jesus turns it back on the scholar and asks, "How do you read the law?" Well, his answer is flawless. He combines the heart of the Old Testament by coupling the command to love God above all else, that is with every ounce of energy and devotion that we find in Deuteronomy 6, and also to love your neighbor as yourself, which comes from Leviticus 19. Jesus and the scholar are in agreement, which should be cause for celebration. They're actually on the same page for once. But the scholar's not really interested in learning or deepening his faith or aligning his heart with the heart of God. Instead, he's trying to expose what he believes are Jesus' heretical views. So the scholar presses further and asks, "Well, but Jesus, who is my neighbor?" And often, as he did in situations like this, Jesus says, "Well, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, a man journeyed from Jerusalem to Jericho down that long, dangerous, rocky path where robbers often hide. Sure enough, the man is attacked. He's beaten and stripped of his clothing and left for dead. Along come two religious leaders, members of his own spiritual community. But rather than stopping to see how or if they might help the injured man, those two distance themselves from him, steering clear of him completely. Later, a Samaritan, that is an outsider, comes along. He sees the injured man, and his heart is stirred with compassion. And as often the case, compassion also moves him toward the man in need. Compassion does that. So he pours oil and wine on his wounds. He bandages him, loads him onto his donkey, and takes him to an inn. Using his own money to cover expenses, he asks the innkeeper to take him in and care for him, promising that he'll come back and pay any remaining debt. So Jesus says, of the three, which was the true neighbor to the man who was beaten? Well, we know the answer just as the scholar did. The one who showed mercy, which I define as compassion in action. Jesus then drives the point of the parable home by saying, now go and do likewise. Because in Jesus' mind, to know the truth is to live the truth. It's not simply an idea that occupies our minds. It's a practice and a way of living each and every day. This story is so commonplace that the meaning of the word Samaritan has changed over time. I looked it up on recently, and the first definition is not a person inhabiting Samaria in biblical times, which seems like that ought to be right there at the top of the list, but rather a Samaritan is a charitable or helpful person. So to be a Samaritan is to help someone in need. Now, most people I know want to be a good Samaritan. If you see someone in trouble, you stop and help. This isn't even a matter of faith. This is about being a good human being. So if confronted with a crisis or an emergency, we're likely to stop and help. But that's not really what Jesus was trying to teach here or say here, that helping others is good. We already know that. But I'm also certain that Jesus was not using this parable to divide people into opposing categories of hero and villain, as this parable is sometimes presented. Over the years, I've heard it used to rip apart the priest and Levite as cold-hearted, rule-keeping religious phonies who are devoid of compassion and blind to what it means to truly know and follow God. This might be true, but that isn't what the parable says or necessarily even implies. Like, what if we gave both of them the benefit of the doubt? What if both of them thought the man really was dead, and that by touching him, they would become ceremonially unclean and unable to fulfill their duties and commitments and responsibilities to others who were counting on them? Or maybe they were genuinely afraid robbers were waiting to turn on them too. Has fear ever caused you to make a choice you might not otherwise make? Or maybe they had a commitment that seemed so urgent, so important, it would cause some conflict and chaos for others. Now, please hear me. I'm not excusing their actions because Jesus doesn't. But what I am trying to do is to understand and explain why they might have made that decision, because at least in my life, I found myself in those circumstances where I felt confronted with competing duties and responsibilities and choices in which the right or best option is not always crystal clear. I think it's important to remember this as we read this parable, because otherwise it becomes very easy to only see ourselves as the hero who's making the obvious choice. The parable, you see, is not about helping someone in need, not just that. Jesus is pressing us to be a good neighbor to those we find hard to love. By making up Samaritan a part of the story, Jesus is trying to expand the scholar's concept of neighbor and our concept of neighbor to help us see that it's not limited to bloodline or borderline, but includes anyone, even those we would otherwise view as our enemies, or maybe even find difficult to trust, or maybe even hate. You see, those Samaritans were not just people inhabiting Samaria. They were despised by the Jews, and they despised the Jews. They were half-breeds, mixed blood by marriage. When a few Jews were left behind during the Assyrian exile, they married Gentiles and were mixed blood. Even worse, they had adopted heretical beliefs and practices. Instead of accepting the whole Hebrew Bible, Samaritans only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Rather than worshiping in the temple like every good Jew, Samaritans built an altar on a mountain that they considered sacred and worshiped there. But in the story, the hated one, the Samaritan, puts all of that aside and does something extraordinarily ordinary. He helps a person in need who just happens to be one of them. Not one of us, but one of them. And in doing so, models divine love and compassion for fearful, overly busy, self-protective people like me, and maybe even some of you. It's a remarkable story that challenges us to ask a crucial question: how am I being a neighbor to those whom I struggle to love when they're in need? Now, there's another perspective within this story that I'd like to consider today. Especially in the Middle Ages, it was popular to interpret the Bible allegorically. An allegorical approach seeks to connect Jesus with stories in the Old Testament. And though I don't usually find it a helpful way to read or understand the Bible, it can occasionally help us see a passage in a new light, if in fact there's a connection to be made in the text. Well, one church leader, St. Augustine, was famous for allegorical preaching. He absolutely loved it and came up with countless, and some would say baseless, connections between the Old Testament and the New Testament stories. Now, I confess I'm not always a fan of how Augustine did this, but one allegorical sermon he gave based on this story of the Good Samaritan has long intrigued me, and I want to reflect on it for a moment, because I think it's relevant to how we friends live out the gospel in our time and place. The short story of Augustine's message was that he believed the church in this story was the innkeeper, where Jesus brings those who are battered, wounded, suffering, and in need of healing. They're a community of long-suffering care and healing, and a place where reconciliation happens, where lives are changed, and a place and a people that we can point to as evidence that Christ's kingdom has actually come. We embody this reality. Now, of all the people in the story, it's the innkeeper who's often forgotten. She or he is an extra in the story, probably just helping out for the money, right? But what if this person was actually caring and good, like we would want to be if we were the innkeeper, or like we would hope someone would be for us? The truth is, the innkeeper takes some very bold action and risks a great deal in this story. I mean, a person on the verge of death is brought to the door. Would you open it for them? The innkeeper welcomes them in, having no idea what it will mean or how long it will last or the impact this relationship will have on their time, energy, and resources. Would you be so welcoming? The Samaritan promises to come back, but there are no guarantees he will. Would you risk taking this person in? In the meantime, it's their task to care for them, to manage the resources, to help them learn to stand again and walk again and get their life back together and in the end become whole. Now, Augustine describes this kind of care as the work of the church, modeled by the innkeeper. As the church, we're called to take in and care for those who are so beaten and wounded by life, who have no strength on their own to carry on. This is the kind of long-term work of healing that is so much a part of the gospel. And I think especially the work of meetings and churches like yours and mine. Unfortunately, we live in a world where there are so many emergencies, so many crises, that it's easy to forget how important this work of ours remains. Many of us have seen our attention spans grow very short. Often our response to situations are more like putting Band-Aids on deep, gushing wounds rather than providing the kind of sustained care that is going to help people find healing and restoration. Immediate care and intervention is absolutely essential, don't get me wrong. But my question for friends is whether our meetings and churches are also willing to do the often less noticed, the less glamorous, and usually more exhausting, costly, and even risky work of helping the weak and wounded, the suffering, find complete healing, find their lives again, find God again. Are our communities willing to be the people and place where lives are restored and made whole? Are our communities the kind of places where a temporary stay turns into a permanent home, becomes a family, and even a place to begin ministering to others in that same spirit and manner where the wounded have experienced their own healing? I think this is the kind of neighbor love. This kind of neighbor love is as important as all the other forms of ministry we engage in today, in part because it's the easiest for us to neglect when the world feels in crisis.